I could feel my skin still flushing between the heat of belligerent anticipation and the cold dread of anxiety. My encounter with Harold at the rectory, whether a dream or a genuine vision, left me surging with adrenaline. A confrontation was coming. As I drove closer towards the center of downtown, where the chantry was located, the still shining sun was slowly replaced with looming shadows of concrete, metal, and glass. The temperature seemed to fall moment by moment as the buildings rose higher into the sky. I quickly slid into the first available parking spot next to the cathedral, ripping off my seatbelt and tearing out my wallet. I fumbled through it to find my celebrate, the small ID card issued to priest which, among other things, guaranteed the diocese parking warden wouldn't give me a tow the moment I left my car. In the midst of searching, I was startled by a sudden sound. Tap, tap, tap. My glance shot up, likely looking half crazed, as I eyed the man who had just rapped on my window. He was tall, portly yet well built. He leaned down to look into the car, an older man, more middle-aged than elderly, wearing a black polo and khaki shorts. Suddenly, seeing his face, emoting something between annoyance and concern, I realized who I was looking at. "Bishop Joseph," I explained, suddenly realizing I was muffled behind the closed car door. He chuckled a bit, opening the door for me. "Gray," he began, his deep voice practically resonating down the entire block, "I was wondering when you might get here." I stepped out of the car, shutting the door and turning to properly greet him. "Well, it was, a rather busy drive, Your Excellency." I hesitated a bit, remembering his reputation for being a bit casual. I thought it best to forego reverencing his episcopal ring, a sign of his office, lest combined with the cassock I was wearing, he mentally labeled me as troublesome and traditional. At the very least, I thought at the time, he would think I'd adapted well to living with CK. "I see you've adapted to living with Kelly," he said, with a chuckle, looking me up and down. "I'm a broad church guy, Gray, to borrow a term from our English brethren. Come inside and get caught up on things." Turning towards the chantry, he gave a quick wave to the parking warden, who had already stopped outside to eyeball me. The warden gave a curt nod and walked back inside as Bishop Joseph gestured me around the block, towards the front of the cathedral. Although our pace was hurried, and the sight of the cathedral was nothing new to me, having been through it 100 times before, I was still enraptured by its beauty as we walked through the towering oak doors. The bright white interior was, even in the absence of direct sunlight at this hour, still bathed in the colorful radiance from the windows, a dozen spanning the length of the nave. They showed images from sculptures of saints and other signs and symbols. 4 marble side altars stood in place along the wall, each with a statue sitting on the reredos above it. Tall columns of soaring domes intensified the scale, all leading the eye to the unfortunately bare chancel, containing only a small table-style altar, a few chairs, and a lectern, consequences of a recovation some decades prior. "Funny how it always gets you, eh?" Bishop Joseph admiringly said. "Yeah, she's always been beautiful to me." "Me too," his voice took on a quiet, serious quality. "I see plenty of your brother priests just pass through here like she was nothing. So, it's just nice to hear you say that." He turned, walking left towards a sequestered room which held the baptistry. As I followed, he gave a quick sequence of knocks on the worn antique door, carved with the baptismal symbols. The door unlocked and opened, revealing a worried-looking CK. He quickly ushered us inside and locked the door behind us. The interior of the baptistry was richly detailed, almost Gothic in contrast to the sober interior of the church. Rich images adorned the puginesque walls, which were bathed in a soft blue light emanating from a large window portraying the baptism of Jesus. Sitting in a pew inside the marble baptismal font was Ezra, a look of anxiety on her face. I felt a familiar hand on my shoulder, and turned to see CK, an apologetic look on his face. "Gray, I'm sorry for leaving you, but we had no choice." "It's okay. I've been worried, but I'd just like to know what's going on." He gave a short nod, walking over to Ezra and sitting down next to her. Bishop Joseph spoke up. "The story she told you to matched the story she told me, down to the smallest details. So, it's a valid case?" I questioned. Bishop Joseph paused for a moment and thought. "Oh, for the love of God," CK piped up, "of course it's valid." "I see the signs in her story as well as anyone else," Bishop Joseph interjected. but the fact remains that you're asking me to approve a major exorcism from an entirely different person, a man you haven't even interviewed, only based on her story." CK shot to his feet in indignation. "Explain the vision, then. Explain how you saw him." My blood ran cold. "You saw him too?" I asked breathlessly. CK shot me a worried look, seeming to peer into my soul. "Gray, something to add?" I took a breath, slowly recounting the dream I'd experienced at the rectory. With each detail, it seemed as if both CK and the bishop were becoming acutely alarmed. Ezra, listening intently, eventually leaned over and buried her face in her hands. Exhaustion covered her every expression. I finished my story, feeling exhausted by the telling. CK and the bishop shot each other glances. "I saw the same thing," Bishop Joseph revealed. "This morning in my residence, I was sitting on my couch, reading through the prayers of today's Mass when I noticed the lights looking odd." "And the fog?" I inquired. He gave a solemn nod. "The man asked me the same thing as you, except..." He paused, rubbing his hands together in a moment of anxiety. "He knocked at my door, walked into my foyer, the entire house filled with a choking fog." "We need to bless your house again," CK quipped. "The chantry too, most likely. Demons shouldn't have been able to do that. Your scumbag predecessor clearly sinned the place out of any protection." The bishop gave an exasperated sigh, throwing up his hands in a moment of resignation. "I am firmly aware, which is why we both agreed to hold this meeting in the cathedral instead of my home." The bishop cleared his throat and continued with his story. Each time he spoke, he became more and more enraged. He seemed to be transforming, changing into something. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. "I thought he was going to kill me right then and there. I couldn't run, couldn't scream, so I just prayed. Prayed the one thing I remembered that I thought could help. From the old Mass back in my childhood. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. And, like you said, a blinding light, a scream. I jolted up and was suddenly sitting in my chair again. I thought it was just a dream, but..." He trailed off for a moment. "After Mass, I got a phone call." He looked towards CK. "And the pastor had just experienced the same thing." I shot my glance towards CK. "You too, huh?" He nodded at me. "Right after you left, I went to sit with Ezra for a moment, and all the telltale signs started up. The same dreadful set of tricks. I walked right out the front door expecting you. Demons love trying to set the mood, kid. Don't let them. Saw him materializing right outside that salt circle. Real tough guy move." I slowly smiled. "What did you say to him? The same things?" "Of course not. It knows I'm not about to give up anyone for the sake of being left alone. The demon knows it's a lie. I know it's a lie, and the demon knows that I know." "So, what did he say?" "Oh, nothing unusual. He was gonna kill you, kill the bishop, drag Ezra by a hair to the fires of hell, yada yada yada. Come back to infest the parish with a legion and drive me insane. The usual cacophony of BS. The bishop shot him a glare, which he returned with a dismissive roll of his eyes. "Did he just leave? Did you have to fight him off?" "Oh, we made a big show of poisoning himself like he was going to attack me then and there. Didn't mean anything, though. I woke up back in my chair after I told him to take his ass off back to hell where he belonged." "Calm it down," the bishop warned. "This is a house of God, and I won't have you swearing in it." CK put his hands up for a moment, diffusing the situation. "Apologies, Your Excellence. Just wanted to give him all the details." Ezra suddenly shot up from her chair, her face red and her eyes streaming with tears. "Kelly, you know he's avoiding the issue." She stared at the bishop. "Please, Bishop Joseph, let him and Father Gray take this case. Don't make the same mistake Langford made." CK seemed to grimace the moment the name passed Ezra's lips. "Ezra, please," CK calmly said. "Bishop Langford," I thought. "How does Langford factor into this?" Bishop Joseph sighed, looking down at the floor for a moment. There was a great silence, and after a few moments, in utter frustration, I spoke up. "For the love of God, would someone please tell me what's going on?" I boomed. CK and the bishop looked at each other for a moment in silence, seeming to affirm a mutual decision. Ezra touched CK's arm, and he turned to look at her. "Kelly, please," she quietly asked. "PadreGrey deserves to know." CK nodded soberly, sitting down in a pew next to the font. Ezra followed, still wiping tears from her eyes as she sat down next to him. "Please," he quietly told the bishop, "sit down." We joined them in the pew, sitting on either side of CK and Ezra. I had never seen CK in this state before. Absent of his usual sarcastic bravado, he seemed to have developed an atmosphere of resigned vulnerability, resting his arms on his knees and looking towards the baptismal font for a moment. I could see his lips moving, uttering some prayer known only to himself and God. Finally, he sat back up, adjusting his cassock and beginning to speak. "Being an exorcist has changed over the years. Changed a lot. I didn't start out as an exorcist, of course. When I was ordained back in '48, I spent damn near a decade sitting between 3-year stints in different parishes. Being a pastor took ages then, plenty of priests to go around. Different world than the one you're in, Gray." He glanced over at me, and a look of fatherly affection crossed his face. "It was in 1959 that I finally received a curious call from Bishop Hodges, Lord rest him, to come to an ambiguous meeting at the chantry. As it turned out, he was assigning me to shadow our team of exorcists. There were 3 back then, good men all of them, Arthur, Victor, and Chester. Still remember them well, still pray for them every day." Hearing CK recount this time in his life struck a chord with me. He seemed so natural, so confident in his words, and I hadn't quite considered that he was once a student too. The years went on, bishops came and went, Hodges passed away, Whitmore passed through on his way to a red hat at the archdiocese. Then the clock struck 1972, and he came. I could hear his disdain biting through. "Langford," Bishop Joseph said with a frustrated sigh. "Langford," CK said sharply, the name shooting off his tongue like a hot coal. "Young for a bishop, and cool. The committee tried to butter us up before we got him, but I wasn't a moron. I knew, pretty much all of us old-timers knew, what had been happening in the seminaries, the laxity, the willingness to let anyone through in the name of progress." Bishop Joseph sighed in frustration. Looking over at him, I could see his figure slightly slumped, mirroring CK's own resignation. 30 years, CK sighed. "For 30 years I bit my tongue, stayed in my parish, did my work. Every time he tried to resign me out of some ministry, I fought like hell, taking it up as far as Rome. When they told him to cut it out, just leave the poor old exorcist alone, he took that to heart. He never assigned me a single apprentice. I called on my brothers from the old days when I needed to, but the slow march of time eventually took them all to the Lord. Langford did what Rome told him to. He left me alone." He leaned forward and removed his glasses, staring ahead at the font and contemplating. I could see a faint mist in his wrinkled eyes, which he promptly wiped away, putting his glasses back on before sitting up straight. "Spitting in the face of my work wasn't enough either. He had to spit in the face of my ministry, of our ministry. The whispers started after a few years, then they grew into rumors, and finally became threats directed from him. There were plenty of badly taught priests in that time, not malicious, just ignorant. They may have frustrated me, but they held down assignments. Others, though, moved to a new place every few years, constantly avoiding clergy events, driving away their flock with their inexplicable reasons, rushed announcements about lasciviousness every year, committals to St. Dymphna, sudden decisions to enter distant monasteries. Langford was an evil man, shocked at the candid statement which Bishop Joseph had made. "Nothing can make up for it, not a damn thing. When it all came to light 6 years ago, after he had retired and been installed, his last act of insult to the faithful, after abusing them, hiding those who hurt them, and destroying their churches, was to die before they could see justice. CK made a short, hushed laugh and looked towards me. Gray, I need you to know what kind of man he was. You have to understand it for everything to make sense. He wasn't just hiding criminals and heretics. He was a criminal and a heretic. He didn't believe, which is why, before Rome demanded he leave me alone, he tried everything he could to interfere. There was a pause, and in the silence I noticed a heaviness in my chest, anger, profound sadness. It's all true, Bishop sighed. Every bit of it. When the Vatican assigned me here and told me how horrendous things had become without them realizing, it didn't take long to get sense of the work that needed to be done. I've tried, I truly have. I've lascivized criminals, helped prosecute them, tried to be as transparent as possible. You've done well, CK admitted. I give you crap. I do it because I'm still angry about it all. But you funded my parish again, promoted my work. You even assigned me an apprentice. He glanced at me for a moment, beaming. Then he turned back to the bishop. I just don't understand why you can't trust me in this matter. Kelly, it's not for a lack of trust. It's the inescapable sense that the situation is beyond us. All I want, and I don't see anything beyond a cursory similarity to the incident the story is leading up to, is to inform the police that there may be a murderer involved in this. Just get one cop to follow you along. Some of them are parishioners. I know one of them would be willing. This is why CK is having this reaction, because he doesn't want a cop following us. CK, I interjected, what's the story? Why are you so opposed to this? It's about my parents, Ezra nodded. That's what this has all been about. I shot a quizzical look at CK. He met it, gave a short nod, and, after a moment of thought, proceeded to tell me the rest of the story. Ezra's parents, Matthew and Josephine, were originally members of St. Justine's. I married them there, baptized Ezra there, gave her her first Holy Communion. But then, Langford set out to break my parish, and he relied on his usual threats. He sent letters to the younger families at St. Justine's, telling them they had been canonically transferred to his new experimental faith community in the suburbs, Agua Vida Catholic Community. Never mind the fact that he had no right to do that. Never mind that you can't mandate which parish someone attends. And never mind that every single one of those failed experiments resulted in pain and massive apostasy. CK sighed, regaining his composure. He told them that refusing to attend the community would be a mortal sin. A liar through and through, Bishop Joseph spoke up. Yeah, but it worked. Families tearfully said their goodbyes, including Ezra's. But they kept in touch. Matthew was less than impressed with the laxity of the place. Josephine wasn't crazy about the priest either. She was teaching Sunday school and she loved it. Everything was going well, at least for a while. Ezra had turned 13 and I had the chance to attend her confirmation. Then, Josephine stopped writing, stopped calling. This was in '86. A few months went by and my work kept me too busy to stop and check in. Then, the night of the Pentecost Sunday, I got a knock at the rectory door and found Matthew standing outside with a look of panic, Ezra at his side. I remember it, she said quietly. I invited him inside and he told me what had happened to Josephine. She had gone into a depressive fit and tried to take her own life. Slit her wrists, you see. They had brought her back from the hospital and she was resting, but Matthew had learned. Josephine had told him why she had done it. She was hearing voices. A chill crept up my spine. They started just before she stopped writing me. She had an experience which in the moment, destroyed her sense of truth and belief. The priest at their community had always been friendly, but especially to Josephine, always coincidentally showing up at the same time she was preparing materials or lessons for her Sunday school class. But he went from being friendly to being downright flirtatious. I could hear Ezra sniffling and looked over to see her weeping again. One day, he confessed he wanted her, tried to convince her that she wanted him too. She refused, but he wouldn't stop. He tried to kiss her, tried to do more. She hit him, knocked his sorry ass to the ground, but then he became angry. He left her alone, but started publicly shaming her, blaming her even though she was the victim. Claimed she came on to him, calling her a whore and a harlot. Mom loved the church, Ezra spoke up. She and Dad both, but this destroyed her. A man she was supposed to trust, supposed to confide in, a man she called father. Turned out he was anything but. And the voices? I asked. Was he possessed? CK thought for a minute. Truth is, kid, I doubt it. I think it was probably entirely psychological. When someone's world gets torn down like that, the mind can be pretty unforgiving. So, what did you do? I made a mistake. CK cast his glance downward. I sent Matthew back home and told him I'd be over the next day. Then I called Langford and I was just so enraged. All my anger came spilling out. I told him that his new priest had done something, screamed at him for destroying the screening and formation process, and told him exactly what I thought of him, said I was going to expose every bit of his horse crap. What did he do? Oh, he was perfectly cordial at first. Smug little bastard. Told me how he cared about my anger and wanted to make things right. Somehow he talked me into having a cop come with me to their house. Claimed it was just for our safety. She was suicidal after all, he kept saying. I felt off about it, but I eventually agreed. You didn't know, Father Kelly, Ezra said through tears. You couldn't have known. That doesn't make it any easier or any less my fault, Ezra. I should have called him. I noticed Bishop Joseph's face contorting in a mix of sadness and anger. The next day I showed up at their house a bit early, hoping to give her some comfort before the cop arrived. We sat in her kitchen at the table and had coffee. She told me everything and, between bouts of crying, thanked me for coming. I heard her confession, gave her the anointment of the sick. Matthew and Ezra came in and joined us afterwards. We told stories, even tried to laugh. It was a beautiful moment. Then the door flew open. CK was looking intensely ahead, his fists clenched tightly together. I didn't recognize the cop. He was older, dark glasses, shaved head. I motioned Ezra away from the table and stood up, walking over to him. And as soon as I was out of the way, he just... His voice became frail and broken. He started screaming at Matthew and Josephine. Drop the knife, step back, stop, this is your last warning. I was confused, turning to look at them as they jumped up in fear. Things seemed to happen so slowly. Their faces were somewhere between confusion and terror. Matthew had put his hands up, and I saw Josephine's eyes grow wide. I looked back at the cop and saw him draw his gun. I started to yell, realizing why he'd been yelling, to fool anybody listening from the outside. I remember my hands lunging forward, but it was too late. He shot them. My heart sank, and I could feel anger welling up inside me. 2 shots each, right in the heart. Bang, 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 CK screamed, his frail, loud voice echoing through the baptistry. Ezra pulled her knees to her face and began crying profusely. I looked back, and they were gone, on the floor, bleeding out. Time seemed to be returning. and I realized I had fallen to my knees. I felt cold metal on my forehead, and I looked up to see him peering over me, his mouth contorted in a sick smile. He said to me, "I'm not afraid to kill you too, old man." His voice was so cold, heartless, and calculating. "Forget what you saw here. Forget what she told you. Get off back to your little church and pretend they've gone to heaven." I felt frozen and afraid. I stood up and saw Ezra sitting in the corner of the kitchen, staring at her dead parents. I couldn't just leave. I asked him what he was gonna do. He holstered his gun and laughed. "Langford didn't pay for the girl. Now get on out before my backup gets here." CK buried his face against his hands. So I did. I left. I drove away just as a dozen cops pulled in and flitted into the house. And when I walked back into the rectory, still in a stupor, I found a note on my desk. "Don't cross me again." CK began to cry, his frail, storied voice pouring out pain. I realized I was weeping as well. A stream of sorrowful drops fell from my face, plunked onto the stone floor of the baptistry. Ezra started forward, her eyes seemingly emptied. Bishop Joseph was bent over, staring into the floor with a look of horror. For a few moments, we all sat in the dismal silence, punctuated only by sobs from the most resilient man I had ever met. After a moment, CK straightened up, his wrinkled face burning red. I put my hands on his shoulder, trying to provide some sort of comfort. He looked at me, eyes still wet. "Gray, sometimes demons are just men, wicked, evil, fallen men, and we can't exorcise that." Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. Whew, that was a big story. I think we're coming down to the end of the PadreGrey series, but I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. If you have, you can go ahead and thank Glenn Jenkins, because this was his suggestion, and what a grand suggestion it's been. I'll be sad to see the story end, but I certainly can't wait to see how it all shakes out in the end for Father Gray and CK and everyone involved. If you've enjoyed this story and enjoy what we do on the channel, maybe hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. If you have, maybe think about hitting that bell so you don't miss a story. We update 3 times a week, and I'd really hate for you to miss one of the great stories we have on this channel. It's finally come to pass that the YouTube gods have decided to monetize me, so I hope you're looking forward to maybe more stories every week, maybe some bonus stories or some surprise stories here and there. I think you'd like them. Let's go ahead and thank our patrons. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle and Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors. And thanks to Glenn Jenkins, the finder of this story, for being my Ghostwriter tier contributor. Thanks, guys. The fact that you guys pay money, no matter how much it is every month, means the world to me, and I just couldn't do the show without you. If you too would like to be a part of the show, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you too can be part of our Spooky Skeleton tier army, and have your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every video that I make. I'll be the first to admit I've been a little lax on my TikTok shoutouts lately, but I'm trying to get back into that now that my job schedule has, kind of evened out a little bit. If that's not quite your thing, and maybe you're looking for a book instead, I've got a link in the description to my Amazon page. Might I suggest Stragview Stories? It's a collection of my prison short stories, and it was a lot of fun to write, so I imagine it'll be a lot of fun to read, too. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.